As we've begun all our other meetings, let's begin with a wee word of prayer. Let's pray. Lord, another lockdown day, another day of Zooming and virtual meetings, another day of juggling homeworking with homeschooling, another day of keeping the cat from Zoom bombing. Lord, in the midst of all of this, you are with us as you always are. Help us in the midst of our planning ahead to remember that if we let you, you will guide us. We give thanks for those who are there to help. And thinking about the possibilities ahead, we give thanks for Brian and the team in the General Trustees Department. And thinking about how the church communicates its news and the good news, we give thanks for Ruth and the communications team. Bless our time with them this morning, and bless them in all they do in our name and in your name. Amen.
Amen.
So I'm going to now hand over to Mr. Kerr, who's going to open up with just a few words.
Thanks, Shura. Just to let everyone know, as well as we have been doing in past Zoom meetings, we are recording this with the permission of Brian and Ruth. I say permission, but they agreed. And the idea for that is so that we can put it on the Ministers' Forum for anyone who can't make it, who can catch up. And that's been really, really helpful. Can we ask everyone just now to mute your microphone? Just if you're not speaking, that would be really helpful. The format of today is going to be presentation and open questions. So I'm saying a few words and then we'll move to Brian Auld on the guidance, Ruth MacLeod on communicating that message and where those challenges might be. And then we'll move to open questions for hopefully a good 45 minutes or more of the time that we have before 11:30. So we are going to allow as many questions as we can. We're going to have a time of listening. We know this guidance has been challenging. I've been fortunate enough to be part of the group that's been meeting to come up with this, and it's been a really challenging group to be a part of as we try to think certainly from my perspective, from a parish minister and a presbytery clerk, on how we can help our congregations move to reopening. But the first thing we want to say today is, what are we reopening and why are we reopening? Now, I think in a very basic level, we'll all know the answer to that question. However, perhaps we need to think a little bit deeper. We all know we want to open our churches. In fact, there's something quite mesmerising after a period of being out of our church for 3 or 4 months. There's something quite mesmerising about that tantalisingly close moment of being able to open our church and get back in. In the Church of Scotland, we are about to have what I think is going to be a new tradition of opening our churches for prayer, which we've never really had in our tradition before, except in a few churches, but yet it's tantalising because people can then come to church. But then again, that also has its challenges. What happens if 100 of your faithful members want to just check that the church is there on the same day? There are management issues that we have. But what does it mean to be the church? There's a section in the guidance that we've put in to encourage Kirk sessions to think about that. And in fact, Lanark Presbytery has instructed all Kirk sessions to have a discussion around this very fact. Do you know, what are the things that we've picked up in this period of lockdown that we want to continue and grow? What are the things that we've had to let go, that we're happy to keep let go and say, do you know what, they've had their day? What are the things that we've had to let go in this period of lockdown that have caused grief and bereavement and loss to our church communities and our families? And do we have to pick them back up? And how do we manage that? How do we cope with those feelings of loss As ministers, is there something that we need to do to articulate that within our communities and to help people think about the stuff that they have lost during lockdown? Family members or friends, people they went to church with that will never be back. Perhaps it's a loss of time or independence for people. Perhaps it's a loss of your child's education. At some point in this lockdown, everyone has experienced some loss. And we need to look at what our churches can do to help communities go through that. And I hope there's perhaps a role for our discussion forum in trying to navigate that very question and supporting each other with ideas and resources that we can have. We share ideas about Blue Christmases or services of remembrance for those who have lost loved ones. We could make this something like that as well, where we actually support each other in devising some resources for that. And undoubtedly, there's going to be an impact on planning at a presbytery level as well with this. We are already aware that there may be some churches that really struggle to reopen at any time. But do we have to do presbytery planning? Do we have to do resourcing in a new way where those churches can be supported in ministry and in care in different ways from different places? Do presbyteries need to look at how churches can not all have to reopen at the same time, but perhaps in clusters have a church that opens, as one presbytery is proposing, so that energies can be put there? What about linkages? Can they help with resourcing so that one church can open and they can contribute to the extra costs of cleaning and supporting within that? There are so many possibilities, but right at the very heart of this has to be the question: how do we be the church in this new age? What are we reopening for? How are we reopening? And what's the point of our reopening? And once we've answered some of those questions, we might be able to go on to the practicalities of what it means to open our church. And with those comments, I would encourage you to read that part of the guidance. But I'm going to hand over to Brian Auld now to take us through some of the guidance and some of the thoughts with us this morning. Brian is the Assistant Secretary at the General Trustees and has been looking after the safety of our buildings for a number of years. And anyone who has any questions about church safety or health and safety will have spoken to Brian at one point. So if you haven't met him before, you're about to see what he looks like now. So Brian Auld, it's over to you for the next part of our session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If there's a wee thing there. Okay, thank you very much, Brian, for inviting me along this morning. It's nice to see so many familiar faces and some faces that I've not had the privilege of meeting quite yet. I just want to spend the next 5-10 minutes just talking a wee bit about the guidance and why we published it in the format that it is. It's been a really challenging time. I know it's been challenging for people out in congregations, but also for those in the national office. When we're looking at policy, when we're looking at what's happening with the Scottish Government, when we're looking at the legislation, it is continually changing, and that's been a huge challenge, particularly when we have so many staff who are on furlough. So we are having to pick up a lot more work and prioritise how we are helping congregations. But I'm sure you're all aware that there is specific legislation. It's not just guidance, but there is legislation in place dictating what we can use church buildings for at the present time. And the good thing is, well, certainly good from my perspective, is a large number of congregations have remained open to support their local community. Now, this has either been through the provision of food banks, helping homeless charities, helping with the care of vulnerable children or those children of key workers. And that's been really, really good because it has put the focus of the church back into the community. And people are looking at churches in a different way now. So while these churches have remained open, one of the things that we've been doing in the General Trustees is supporting them to make sure that they can adhere to Scottish Government guidelines. And some of these guidelines are not as simple as they first seem. But while supporting them, we've also been very mindful of the churches that are closed and the pressures that has been put onto their buildings and looking after their buildings. And there has been some conflict between what's been required from the Church of Scotland Insurance Services, what's required under legislation, and what's been required under Scottish Government guidelines. And one of the biggest issues here is because Aviva, who provides the vast majority of the insurance cover, predominantly has based their guidance on English legislation. And we're not on par with English legislation at all. There is some very significant differences between what's happening in England, Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland. And of course, we have to remember that we have congregations in England. So that's been very interesting from my perspective as well. One of the biggest problems with the legislation as it's been written is it's not differentiated between a place of worship, i.e. a church building, and those congregations that have a separate church hall. It's basically encompassed this whole concept that a church is a church. So when we closed church buildings, it really did mean that those churches who are lucky enough to have halls which are not attached should also have closed as well. And that's had a huge impact on the wider community. We are working with the Scottish Government just now quite closely to try and fix this. Now, we're 13 weeks in, we know time is ticking on. They realise that perhaps the legislation could have been worded in a slightly different way. But it is what it is, and that's what we have to work with at the present time. One thing to be mindful of about this guidance document is the Health and Safety Executive has been very, very clear, really from the second week, that COVID-19 is a specific risk factor within all organisations. And that's why they're specifically asking that work is undertaken to make sure that your buildings are safe and can promote good hygiene practices and protect anyone who comes into your building from the risk of COVID-19. Now, the good news is if we strip back all the words, there is only a small handful of things that we need to be looking at in our church buildings. Now, the first one is obviously space, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. The second one is about cleaning and disinfection. Some of you may have logged into the webinars on cleaning and disinfection. There is a recording available of that with some slides which talks about how to effectively clean and disinfect your church buildings. And then the third one is about general good hygiene practices that we should all be demonstrating, whether we're at home or whether we're outside or in a public space. So this is about looking after your hands, it's looking about cough etiquette, and it's thinking about people who come into our church buildings. Are the right people coming into our buildings? If people are not feeling well, then is church the best place for them to be at a particular time? The guidance has been developed in a group format. It's very collaborative because the last thing I wanted, and I know this from experience from working in different agencies, is when you have different guidance coming out from different departments at the one time, it can be very overwhelming. And then you get to the point where you don't know where to start. And the Church of Scotland is a very complex organisation. You know that. So we decided about a month ago to think about, well, let's put together one guidance document that kind of touches on all the different aspects of church life. So we've got things there about buildings, we've got comments there about mission and worship, we've got comments there about the celebratory life of the church, and we're also talking about things, like your weddings and your funerals. So we wanted to put together a document where people can just go to as their first point of call. However, we don't know the answers to everything. And I think that's really important that we get that across as soon as possible. There's things that we just don't know because we don't know where government is going in certain directions. So things like timelines, for example, we really don't know the exact timelines of when churches can start to reopen and really for what purpose. We have the route map, which gives us a basic understanding of what the government is expecting us to do. But until they can turn around and say, your church is safe to open for this particular activity at a particular time, we just have to think about preparing our buildings for as best as we can. One of the issues we've had with the guidance, and this comes back, it's been less than a week since it's been out there, but it comes down to the capacity of church buildings and the 13-metre rule. Now, this is based on some work that has been done in various other organisations, and it does make sense. However, what we do recognise is some people are focusing very much on this 13 number and not really thinking about the wider impact of 2 metres. So we are going to update the guidance and make it a bit more user-friendly. We need people to think about how individuals come into your building, how they can safely occupy your building, and what they're actually doing in your building whilst maintaining some degree of physical distance. And it's 2 metres at the present time. I suspect the 2 metres in Scotland will be there for a considerable period of time. So we are going to make that a bit more user-friendly for people. We also need to think about business support because some congregations, in fact, quite a lot of congregations use their church halls for commercial enterprises, and we have to remember that church halls are effectively closed. Every week there's a particular person who sends me an email, and we have a debate about this, when can they open their community cafe up, etc. Again, we are working with the Scottish Government to try and sort of come to an agreement that not all churches are open for worship purposes. There is a commercial arm to them, and we want to support that. The other thing that's came up over the last week is church buildings being used to support local schools, and I think we've came to an agreement in the National Office that we would certainly support congregations who wish to work with their local schools. We're having some discussions with the government this afternoon to hopefully get some more advice out in relation to that. So we will put together some guidance, some specific guidance, and update it into this guidance document with some further information to help those congregations who wish to offer their spaces for local education. There's 2 other main things. One is construction and maintenance. The Scottish Government has updated their approach to maintenance and construction in ecclesiastical property, so that technically can now go ahead. There is some restrictions on that. I've got an email that will go out this afternoon explaining that in a bit more detail. And then there's the insurance provision as well. So Aviva have agreed to extend the occupied status of church buildings for another 90 days, which will take us up to the 11th of August. So there'll be an email going out this afternoon about that. It's really, really important, and Brian and John Ferguson have been really, really keen to get this across in the guidance about the role of the ministers with regards to reopening church buildings. They're absolutely pivotal. And it's about having a conversation with the wider session and the congregation about what are the right activities for your building at the right time, and when should you be opening your building. No congregation will be forced to reopen their church unless they feel it's absolutely necessary and it's safe to do so. And it's really, really important that the minister is at the heart of these conversations. And then the final part, which Brian has touched on, is about the role of presbytery. Presbytery is there to offer support to congregations, and it's absolutely important that presbytery fulfills that requirement. So if a congregation needs additional support, presbytery should be there to offer that support. So again, we may have to do a wee bit more work in terms of the guidance to make sure that that's communicated a bit more clearly, and that the expectations of presbytery is absolutely at the centre of the guidance. So that's really what I kind of want to say about the guidance, the purpose of the guidance, why it's there, the current format. We are going to produce volume 2 very, very soon to update on many of the points that I've raised. And then we are committed to review the guidance at least every couple of weeks. Now, there might not be an update every couple of weeks, but at least every 2 weeks we'll be sitting down as a group, going through the significant changes which has happened in policy, in practice, legislation, etc., and making sure that it's still reflected accurately within the guidance. As Brian has said, I get a lot of emails and telephone calls every day. That's part of my job. I am here to offer support, to answer any questions. So even if you don't want to ask any questions in this forum, I know it's not for everyone. If people want to drop me an email, I'll be more than happy enough to respond to you. And I'll hand you back to Brian now, if that's okay.
Thanks, Brian. That's really helpful. We are getting a few questions in, but we're going to leave some of those questions just now so that we can hear from Ruth on communicating the message, and then we're going to come back to a time of open questions where those that are being written will be asked. So don't worry, we are keeping them. And Brian may want to check the Zoom chat for some advance notice of some of the questions that are coming up, but they're all very, very helpful, so thank you. Ruth now is our head of communications and has also been a part of the group putting this together, and her department pulled out a Herculean effort and is still doing so in revising any guidance that comes each week if we do have to make changes to that. So Ruth's going to speak to us a little bit on communicating that message and what some of the challenges of that might be. So Ruth, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Brian. Hello, everybody. I am Ruth MacLeod, as Brian said, from the Communications Department. I was going to talk a little bit about what we do in comms for those of you that may or may not have dealt with this, and also what it's been like working in the Communications Department since the coronavirus hit, because I think that context is very important when we consider, you know, how we've gone about doing certain things and how we've communicated certain things, and some of the strictures that are making that harder than it would be normally. So in the team, we have myself, Helen Silvis, who's the communications manager. We have 3 people on the media side: Cameron Brooks, Laura Crawford, and Jane Bristow. On the website, we have Alan Murray, who's our web developer, and Brianne Moore, who's a web editor who's quite new to the Church of Scotland, and 2 designers, Chris Flexon and Steve Walker, who's part-time. Now, in common with a lot of other departments in one-to-one, when we got to the lockdown point, we were asked to furlough a number of our staff to help with the organisational longer-term drive to protect jobs and get some funding in from the UK government furlough scheme. So despite the fact that our workload had easily doubled overnight, we furloughed around half the team in the communications department because we were explicitly asked to do that. So we've had a huge volume of additional work, and we are working with, you know, half the capacity that we normally have. So that has meant there has been bumps along the road, and we're striving to do the best that we can, but in really challenging circumstances. We've also had a number of additional events to support. All of our work has gone online, so it's meant, particularly for things like Sunday services, we found ourselves working every weekend to help signpost Sunday services and events and make sure people are aware of what's going on. We've been involved in working with BBC Scotland to have a terrestrial TV Sunday service for people that aren't online. That's called Reflections at the Quay. We've put forward a lot of Church of Scotland ministers to take part in that, and that's been very well received. We cancelled the General Assembly, which got a huge amount of media attention, but almost immediately said that we would do an online induction for Martin Fair, which we did, and that same weekend we had a Heart and Soul online event. We've done a Pentecost all-church service, which was hosted by Martin Fair. We've done the first ever Assembly Trustees all-church webinar, which was very technically challenging and also challenging from a PR point of view, managing all the issues that were coming out of that. And we're also working very hard to do new moderator comms with Martin Fair, because his job and role has changed, and really he can only do kind of online work now in the current climate. So we've got a lot of that going on at the moment. We've also been asked in the midst of the crisis to deliver on 2 key, very significant bits of work. One is around the fact that we do not have an internal comms function in the Church of Scotland. Now, that is something that I have been talking to the Church about since I came into post. I spoke to Martin Scott about it, who was my first boss, then Martin Johnston. Then the Special Commission, I talked to them about that at great length, and then Dave Kendall when he came in as Chief Officer. I've written a number of papers about it over the last few years. it's taken this crisis really for there to be a bit more of a recognition that actually internal communications is critical. We don't have the resource in place to do that effectively at the moment, including not having the right kind of platforms to share complex information with numerous different audience groups. So my team has been asked to come up with a plan to deliver something that I've been asking for a number of years, which is some kind of intranet platform which would allow us to share information more effectively. But we also need the people to help us get those messages out as well. What that means at the moment is that a lot of the time we're using an external website, an externally facing website to share internal content, and that is not good practice from a comms point of view, but it is a necessity at the moment because of some of these strictures. So that's just worth bearing in mind. We also have a number of issues around donation and getting money in since we've gone into lockdown. So we were asked to find a way of allowing people to donate to the central church, but also to congregations, 1,000+ congregations online. Now, again, I think that is something that finance and stewardship have been talking about. I've been told for the last 8 years. Some people say it's been even longer than that. And then once we went into this crisis lockdown situation, it came to the comms team to say, how can you make this happen? How can you solve this problem? Now we have delivered the functionality to do that in less than 2 months after many, many years of talking about it. Again, technically challenging, not without its bumps, communicating how that's going to happen, but we are straight away now seeing thousands of pounds being donated to the church in an online way. So that's another key thing that's going on at the moment. We've got coming up over the hill Commission of Assembly, another version of the GA around September, October. We've got the reform agenda, which we still need to communicate and do a lot of work on, presbytery reform. So there's a huge amount of things going on for the comms team at this moment. In terms of communicating the messages, our mechanisms for doing that are still the same. You know, we use the media, we use our social media, and that's how we get a lot of our information out, and we use the website. But it's not enough really, I think, for the comms team to signpost that information and share these documents and help find ways of making that very complex information easy to understand. And we really need your help to continue to pass that information on to people who haven't seen the website, who aren't on Facebook. And we need people to discuss the information that's there and feed back to us if it needs, you know, amending or more content, or people aren't understanding the messages. So, you know, ticking the box and saying there's now a story on the website or there's now a new coronavirus page isn't really enough. It is a joint effort, the communications process. It's not something that sits solely with our department. So that's something that I think is very important to get across. During this process, the media interest in what we've been doing has been exceptionally high. So you'll have seen us try and share stories of what ministers are doing in the community, whether that's continuing to run food banks or getting access to funds to support the work they're doing. We've had online betrothal services. We've had ministers, including Brian Kerr and Ruth MacLeod, talking about doing online memorial services for funerals. And in the same way with buildings, we've given the media access to ministers in church buildings alone, performing kind of worship services that they've shared online. And we now have a tranche of media who are asking for the next phase, which will be images of churches reopening. What will that look like? And what will it look like? People in prayer and solitary prayer, you know, an expectation that there'll be lots of posters up about people wearing face masks and keeping a 2-meter distance. So our approach in the comms team is that it is helpful to facilitate that kind of access, but I also have to be quite mindful that it could look very bleak. And we will also have a number of churches that do not open in phase 2 and do not open in phase 3. And we will have to manage the public expectations around that and any fallout that comes from it. Now already on the back of the guidance being published, we saw some pretty immediate media coverage and also social media commentary from people saying, well, this suggests that older people can't come to church, or you know, it's not going to be a welcoming approach. And as ever with these things, we have an organizational responsibility to make sure that when we do invite people back into church, that they're doing that in a way that is as safe as we can make it. And that will involve you know, intensive cleaning regimens and people being kept at a distance. We might not have access to toilets, there won't be teas and coffees. So, you know, inevitably the PR elements of how that is going to look to people will be difficult. And you know, it's possible we could get into scenarios where locally people say you can't come into church because we've already got too many people in this church, and we get into a miserable scenario of turning people away from church. And inevitably, media will be looking for those kind of opportunities to exploit them. You know, there might be a case of a Church of Scotland not being open, but a Roman Catholic church in the same town is open, and media will be coming to us to ask, why is that the case? And I think really what I would want to say to people about that is that we should not be overtly defensive about that. You know, we need to do the risk assessments, assess locally why we're making the decisions we're making. If we're not opening, we can signpost people to the fact that we do have other offerings that are online, or telephone trees and things that we're doing at a kind of terrestrial level to support people through this difficult time. And if you are experiencing difficulties locally, please remember that the communications team is here to help you with those things. Please don't suffer in silence. If you get a media inquiry or somebody complains to you about something that you've decided to do at your church, let us know about it, and let's have a chat about it so we can prepare in case we do get these media inquiries. The other thing to say is that we will work very closely with the other denominations who have press representatives. They're very anxious about this as well. They've got the same pressures that we do about church has to open and we have to get back to normal, when they know, having looked at it, that that's not going to be immediately possible. So again, you know, we are trying to shore each other up and say, let's work collegiately about this and make sure that we do the best that we can for people whilst taking a very measured approach to it. We'll also do what we can to keep the guidance updated, as Brian said, and we're looking at preparing posters that people could print off from the website and use locally that are generic around things like good hand hygiene, keeping a distance, potentially wearing face masks, if that's something that you're going to encourage people to do. So that's a very quick canter through some of the issues that we are dealing with and thinking about. The last thing that I would say is immediately the guidance went up online on Friday. We had a lot of our own ministers on social media kind of leap on to talk about that guidance on social media. Now, I understand the desire to do that, but very frequently people are very critical of the Church of Scotland when they are Church of Scotland themselves, you know. So you're criticising your own organisation, but also people that are working really hard to pull this guidance together. We know it won't be perfect, but if I could make a bit of a plea, it would be to really take care about what you say online, because media do watch what we say. They look for the rows, they look for the unhappiness, and they very easily get stories out of that. So perhaps before that criticism, we're saying there's no mention of organists, or there's no mention of people that are, you know, in my very particular circumstances. Maybe do go and speak to Brian Auld about that first, or do ask comms, you know, why it's been presented in a particular way, because there's a lot of sensitivities around at the moment, and I think we do have to remember that people are trying their absolutely best in mysterious circumstances, to be honest, that we're working our way through. So I hope that helps a little bit, and I'm just happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Ruth. I think it's worth pointing out at this point that furloughing was not a decision by Ruth or by Brian. They were implementing policies that came from others, and I think from what we've seen on the chat, Ruth, there is an awful lot of love for comms and the fact that they should have been there and had more staff in order to communicate those messages. So thank you. I think that's been very helpful. There have been a number of questions pop up that I think have been answered. Stephen asked about stand-up posters. They are coming and they will be available on the church website in due course. You've got to remember that at this point, no churches are open because we're not in phase 2. That has not been announced as of yet. Just running through some of them, there's some things about presbytery and reopening. You know, Sarah said, I don't think we should go to them just if we're stuck. There should be some kind of oversight in decision making. And Marjorie has very helpfully put up that Edinburgh agreed last night that checklists and risk assessments should be signed off by presbytery, and that's intended as supportive and helpful so that congregations don't feel isolated. Lanark, I can speak of, did the same last night as well, for the same reason, that there should be, we felt, some sort of oversight. So I would be surprised if that wasn't coming up again. I'm aware that there's a few people asking about communication channels and the fact that advice is posted on the website at the same time as it's going out to ministers. There's not a chance to discuss it and things like that. And we know there are challenges with internal, external communication. We did go over that with Dave last week quite a lot, and we know that he's trying to sort that out. But I wonder, Ruth, if you have a brief comment on that about, you know, timing and whether it would be helpful to have emails come out to ministers to at least alert them to the fact that the guidance is there, or guidance in it slightly in advance.
Yes.
Are you able to make a brief comment on that?
Definitely. I mean, it is a challenge. I think the reason the buildings guidance had to go onto the external website to tie in with the email is because we were linking in the email to that document. It was quite a big document. It's not a document that we could have emailed out to people because it would have probably broken our IT system. So it needs to go on that external site so that the email message can link to it and people can read it straight away from there. Now, we've talked about having an internet platform in the future, which would allow us to put that information in a more private space, because the problem for us from a PR point of view is when you put it on the website, media are seeing it at the same time as our internal people. And that's not ideal, really, because if we could look at it in an internal space first, we could maybe make some of the tweaks that we've had suggested to us since it went live, you know, and have a little bit of space to work on that before it became a public-facing document. So there is an uncomfortable kind of position with that at the moment, but it's difficult to resolve at this kind of point in time.
Okay, thank you for that. There are a number of questions coming up that I'm trying to keep a track on this as we go through as well. So, Brian, I have a funny feeling you're about to get very busy in the next 10 minutes with some of these questions. Let's kick off with a nice, easy one for you, okay? Debbie has said, why can we sing in the crematorium, but the guidance says we probably won't be able to sing in church? Question mark.
Okay, so the truth about the singing aspect is it's still very much an evolving sort of theme. There is a lot of scientific research out there and a lot of experimentation going on about how much spray we create when we are singing. Now, at the present time, we have taken some advice from various legal angles on this, including some of this, the professional bodies that look after all ecclesiastical and faith bodies, and we have decided to have a uniform reply to this just now, which will say, until we get further evidence, as part of a risk control mechanism, we are recommending that singing does not take place in church buildings at the present time. And that's all I can really say on that at the present time. I'm aware that some crematoriums are allowing it to happen. They have different risk control strategies in place for crematoriums, etc. I have a meeting next week with a crematorium in Edinburgh to discuss this. They're asking for a conversation about this. But at the present time, we've taken the view, based on the evidence that is available in terms of risk, not to ask people to sing in church buildings. And I think that is the right thing to do.
Okay, thank you. Put it this way, folks. Having seen some of the models on the singing and spray thing, when churches, if churches ever fully reopen and we have people in the balcony, I won't be sitting in front of the balcony, put it that way. That's all I'm saying. Now, there's some interesting stuff here. Mandy has posted a question which I think is important, and there's been a couple of comments back and forward about track and trace. Now, there's nothing about track and trace in the guidance, Brian, but how will that affect our opening? What if the minister has to end up self-isolating because they have a text and tell them to do that? And that is a question that I have raised as a presbytery clerk with Faith Nurture, and at the moment not had any satisfactory any reply. But also, you know, is the track and trace thing 2 meters for 15 minutes, therefore it might not affect churches as much? Where are we in the whole track and trace thing within this process?
Okay, well, the track and trace thing is still very much a moving feast as well. It's evolving. Scottish Government policy is evolving on this. Just so you're aware, is you'll all understand that we have an international presbytery, and I've been working with some of the congregations in Europe, but also in Switzerland as well, and a couple of other congregations worldwide, where they have had to implement track and trace policies because it's part of the reopening protocol. And it's relatively straightforward, because if you have a congregation that you know very, very well, at this particular time, it's unlikely you're going to be receiving a lot of visitors that you don't already know, that either are not members of your congregation or not members of your wider community. So it would be relatively easy to implement a track and trace system for a congregation. And the systems we've been looking at in Europe is 14 days. You would maintain a record of 14 days. And basically it's a register. It's like you're in the school. It's a school register. Of course, that opens up some issues with GDPR, for example. We'd have to do a data assessment. The Law Department are aware of that, and we've got Alan on standby should the Scottish Government decide this is something that they want to do. At the present time, I had a conversation with the Scottish Government last week. I was at a meeting with all the other faith groups. It's not something they're planning to put in place in Scotland. However, it's still early days, and it's something that we may be asked to implement. And if that's the case, we will give you all the guidance and help and support to do that. Oh, the other part was if the minister received a text message to say that they had to isolate, then I think it would be it comes down to this moral duty, doesn't it? Because track and trace isn't part of the legislation just now. It's the moral duty that the minister, as part of that conversation with the health protection team, should make them aware of the circumstances of their profession. And if the health protection team asks for information of those who they came into contact with, I personally think that the minister should provide that information if possible. And then it would be up to the health protection team to take whatever action they seem fit in that case.
Excellent, thank you. I think there is, Alistair has put on that surely a self-isolating minister under track and trace is not different from the minister falling ill. Well, I think there is a slight difference in as much as they're not ill. And therefore our illness regulations don't come in. And so the question that we've asked of Faith Nurture is what happens in terms of pulpit supply and all those policies that we have, because if somebody is self-isolating, they are not ill, and that was the policy right back in March as well. So there are challenges there as well. Brian, can I just ask, in terms of distances and whatnot, how far should the minister be from the congregation, and should they be wearing a mask at all times?
Okay, so again, there's nothing specific in any of the guidance that we've been speaking about with the government and other faith communities about the minister having to retain or maintain a specific distance away compared to the 2 metre distance. So that's basically what's in the guidance just now. Now, obviously ministers tend to be a bit more further away, the members of the congregation, apart from when they're welcoming people into church or when they're helping people leave church as well. So there might be some issues there. In terms of it's really quite difficult to actually give any specific advice on this, because all we can work on is the limited advice that is available to us, and we have to try and make that work for each congregation in each church building. And what's unique about the Church of Scotland, and it's something that I'm particularly quite proud of, is that every church building is different, and how we occupy our spaces is different. And I really like that. So it's about working with the guidance that we have available to us just now to try and work the buildings within our favour. Obviously, the things about physical contact is quite important to ministers. So, for example, no handshaking, etc. It's really important that that's demonstrated at all times, that the church is an occupation. Some ministers may find that quite challenging. Going back, tying this into your previous question though about track and trace, the one thing I would say is if any minister believes that they need additional support, particularly in relation to their own health and well-being, it's really important we have a discussion with them from the National Office, particularly from Faith and Nurture, because there is and there should be support available to ministers. So, for example, if they wish to wear a medical grade face mask because, for example, they may have an underlying health condition, that should be allowed. They shouldn't feel the need to justify the need for them to take additional risk control measures. Face coverings in general, if we go back to the Scottish Government plan, they are making reference to that to say that they should be used in enclosed public spaces. Now, again, there is a bit of a judgment call with this, depending on the size of your church building. If you have a very large sanctuary, but regardless of the space standards, you've decided that you only want to allow 10 people in at one time, and they're well spread out, and they can enter and leave your building safely, then the risk is greatly reduced. If you have a medium-sized sanctuary and you decide, because of the number of people in your community, the number of members of your congregation that want to come to church, and you are packing them in within the 2 metre distance, then obviously face coverings may be more appropriate in that circumstance. So there is a wee bit of a judgment call with that. Again, going back to the Scottish Government message, the use of the word should. If we look at Scottish Government guidelines, when they say should, it basically means is you must do this. So be mindful of that as well. But again, I would like to say we are having regular discussions with the Scottish Government on these matters, so the guidance may change as we move forward.
Okay, thanks, Brian. From Hanneke, and I think it's a really important point, airflow. Is there any mention of having to leave doors open during services, for example? I know there's some interesting guidance about keeping doors open in order to avoid touch points.
Yep.
But what about airflow in churches that maybe only have one door in? How does that work, and what are your thoughts on that?
Again, this is something that's evolving. The science behind this is evolving. It's really important that we do have well ventilated spaces. Now, if you are going in to prepare your building for reopening, then certainly I would recommend that you be allowing some degree of airflow. Now, that might be by keeping your doors open, or could be opening any windows that could be opened whilst you're cleaning and preparing your building. I mean, if we're perfectly honest, we're going to have people complaining if doors are open while people are inside a church building. They're not the warmest of environments at the best of times, but we do have to sort of marry this up against the risk. Keeping doors open whilst your church building is open is actually a good way to aid infection prevention and control, because people don't have to then push doors or pull doors, etc. It might be wise to communicate to people who may be coming into your building that they might want to wear a jacket for a period of time, particularly for individual prayer, and whatever format you're going to be offering your prayer if you are opening for that. Is it a 2-hour session where people would be expected to remain in their seat for 2 hours, or is it a case of people can come and go over a period of time? These all add to the risk factors. Airflow is important. The science is continually changing into this. We'll offer some more in-depth advice. I had an architect contact me yesterday providing all these airflow airflow calculations and asking that we recommend churches buy additional mechanical ventilation, which I think is not proportionate to the risk at this present time. So, as I said, we will keep you up to date as this changes.
Thanks, Brian. Very, very briefly, should pew cushions be removed?
Okay, very briefly, I would say yes. Let's remove
Okay.
the pew cushions.
Great. And following on from that, should balconies be used, or is there an inherent risk?
Okay, so in my opinion, balconies do create an additional risk, not just from infection prevention control, but also in terms of fire safety and what to do in an emergency situation. A lot of balconies only have one point in and out. They don't have they don't have the entrance and the exit, or the entrance points at two sides. So that creates an additional risk. Brian and I and Ruth are meeting tomorrow. The group is meeting tomorrow afternoon, and this is on the agenda. So we will put something in the guidance about balconies, but it will be more likely to say we are monitoring this and we will update you as more advice becomes available.
And speaking of our agenda, Brian, two people have just asked, what about fabric chairs in the sanctuary? And I didn't pay either of them to ask that. 3 people. Let's add the numbers going up.
Okay.
You'll like this answer, folks. This is good.
Okay, so in an ideal world, we wouldn't have any fabric at all in our sanctuaries or in our meeting spaces. However, we have to put this into perspective of infection control on a sliding scale. So fabric chairs are a risk. Okay, we can't get away from that. They're a risk factor in all church buildings. However, we have to think about this about all the things that we are doing in our church building to control the infection. So for example, hand hygiene. People should be decontaminating their hands before they come into the church building. So whether that's washing their hands or using alcohol gel. Cleaning and disinfection. All hand contact surfaces should be cleaned and disinfected on a regular basis. Now, the fabric of fabric chairs generally can be cleaned either by using, what do you call it? The word's going out of my mind. Steam cleaning, or you can actually buy specific disinfectants for fabrics. Now, there is a problem with this. One, they're very pungent and they're not very pleasant, how they smell. It does linger for a long period of time. So even if you are spraying your fabric chairs and shutting your doors for 72 hours, you'll still smell it when you come in. Some people may have an allergic reaction to some of the chemicals that are contained within the disinfectant. So these are factors you need to consider. My advice to you is, if people are demonstrating good hand hygiene, you've got general good cleaning and disinfecting practices throughout your building, the risk should be relatively low to fabric chairs. And the reason being is that people sit in the chairs with their clothes on. So there's very, very little skin contact on the fabric element of the chair. What I would say that you might wish to consider is not after every time you've opened your church building, but perhaps maybe every 2, 3, maybe even monthly, you might wish to invest in a handheld steam cleaner and clean your fabric chairs then. But as part of a regular daily routine of cleaning and disinfection, the guidance just now coming from various bodies is the risk is relatively low.
Okay, there's a little bit of discussion on the chat that
wearing clothes.
Well, no, I didn't say about wearing clothes, I promise, but I knew folk would like that answer. But people saying quite specifically that if you shut the doors for 72 hours, you don't need to disinfect anything.
Wrong.
Brian, can you comment on whether that is accurate or not?
It's not accurate at all. What the guidance says and what all the science around this has said, that is, if you close your door for 72 hours, the number of viable, which is live virus particles that may be present in your environment, is reduced to a level which makes the cleaning and disinfection to be carried out more safely. Okay, some virus particles may survive greater than 72 hours. And there is evidence to say that some viruses can actually survive up to 5 days in certain surfaces. So it's about risk control. It's not about risk elimination. You still need to thoroughly clean and disinfect your buildings. Now, what some faith organisations have done is they have said that once you have completed your activity in your building, everyone leaves, you shut your door for 72 hours. You don't actually do any cleaning or disinfection before you leave the building. And then you go back into the building before everyone else comes back in, and then that's when you do your cleaning and disinfection. Now, you may decide to do that, or you may decide to do the cleaning and disinfection as and when the contamination may occur. It's entirely up to the operation of the individual church. But be absolutely clear, adequate cleaning and disinfection, particularly of hand contact surfaces, is absolutely essential.
Okay, thank you. Right, let's move this away from, at the moment, from cleaning. And I'm sure if you want particular ideas about what cleaners can be used, then you're able to contact Brian. I'm sure he has a handy guide that starts with the words of Flora from B&M or wherever else you get it. He's a big fan. But there are presbyteries that we're seeing that are bulk buying. There are some presbyteries like Edinburgh who are bulk buying signage as well, which I think is really helpful, hand sanitizer, etc., etc. Just moving this on from cleaning and whatnot, somebody said they would value specific guidelines for external groups that use our buildings for regular prayer and worship, especially in the sanctuary. Yep. Would it be wise not to allow such groups at this time, even with all the risks involved? Now, I'm not sure we can use our premises at the moment for, or even in phase 2, for any community lets, even if it was another worship group. I don't know how that works, Brian. I think that's a very technical legal question if churches are sharing buildings.
Yeah, so what you have to remember is it's not just guidance that we're working with here, it's actually the legislation, and the legislation is very, very clear that places of worship, church buildings, are not meant to be used at the present time. And when we move into phase 2, that regulation is going to be amended to say only individual prayer. So there'll be no external groups allowed to be using Church of Scotland premises in any shape or form. The one thing I would say is please do not commit with any external groups just now a particular date or time frame when they might be able to come back into your building, because we just don't know that. And the last thing you want to be doing is committing your buildings for a use which the likelihood is you're not going to be able to meet at this particular time. As I said, it's still a wee bit of a moving feast just now. Hopefully the First Minister tomorrow will announce some movement, shall we say, towards confirming a date for phase 2. But even at phase 2, your building cannot be used for external groups. There might be an exception to that, because remember, churches can still remain open to support food banks. They can still remain open to support vulnerable childcare or childcare of key workers. Now remember, schools are going through another policy change at the present time. So you may be approached by your local authority or by your local school about the use of a particular space in your building. If that's the case, please come back to myself and to the law department, because we will be able to offer you some advice on that. So there is specific areas where your building may be used, but it's generally not for community hall lets or anything like that.
Brian, I presume a church project, for example, an arts project or music lessons, that would not be allowed at the moment?
That would not be allowed at the moment,
okay. No. What about a church that hosts medical tribunals? If they're given a start-up, can the church host them?
Now, I suspect medical tribunals will come under the exemption regulations, similar to blood donations, etc., because it's a statutory process. So I would wait to see what they say, but I suspect if they do restart and your church building is used for them, they may approach you to use your building. I suspect under the regulations that would be allowed, yeah.
However, contact the law department and
contact the law department, yeah.
Yep. Now, outdoor stuff, Brian. Outdoor stuff, as far as I'm able to read, and you can tell me I'm completely wrong, and it's recorded, which is fabulous. But theoretically, as long as you can have social distancing or physical distancing and whatnot in place, there could be ways that churches could have groups in the different phases that are about to come up. They can't have any form of shelter or gazebo, because that would be deemed a kind of structure and an enclosed place. But from phase 2, can churches perhaps look at outdoor stuff in a park with families being distanced and then a bit closer in phase 3?
Yes, they can, but we have to go in line with what the Scottish Government is permitting these activities to be. So phase 2, it's individual prayer. So if you have an outside space in your church grounds, for example, and you wish to hold a prayer session outside, you can do that. However, the 2 meters distance general hygiene precautions, etc., would still be in place. The one thing I would remind people is, though, when we talk about health and safety legislation, it does actually extend to outside your church building as well. Occupiers liability, which means that you have to make sure that people who are coming into your properties and land are not going to be faced with any risk which could be avoided. So if you are, for example, decide to have a prayer meeting in your church grounds, but you know there's loads of molehills, it's quite hilly, people are always sliding, falling in their bum, etc., then it's maybe not the best place to have it. If you know there's a risk there, you can try and control it, but if not, you might need to think again. So just bear in mind, outside, you need to look after the risks as well.
And there are specific things in the government legislation about, you know, how many people can gather outside in a park or whatnot coming
absolutely.
up in phase 2. Yeah,
absolutely.
Okay. So I think churches need to, if they want to be thinking about outdoor, need to look at the church guidance, need to look at what the Scottish Government are saying in terms of what's allowable as well. And as Brian said, legislation is really important that we meet. Brian, people are asking, can the stuff about pew cushions perhaps be communicated? Presbytery quoted, the virus doesn't cling to fabric, which is a good one. Yeah, and the other one, people in Presbytery thinking that in phase 4, cleaning and physical distancing will no longer be required. Is that right? And so could churches who don't want all this hassle just wait until then? And is there any comment about all church buildings remaining closed until phase 4?
Okay, so the pew cushions, yep, that will be in the updated guidance, which should be available later this week. As I say, just be mindful, we can't include everything at one time, so it is still a bit of a moving feast. So I will put a wee bit thing about the pew cushions. The churches opening, waiting until phase 4, that's entirely up to the congregational needs, and having a discussion with the minister and presbytery about social distancing and cleaning in phase 4. The Scottish Government is absolutely clear that this isn't just about a short-term change in behaviour or facilities, this is about a long-term view. And I suspect that cleaning and disinfection, including the 2 metre, we have to plan for the long-term view in this, that your church will have to maintain physical distancing well into next year. That's my professional opinion at the present time. So please don't think that if you don't open your buildings just now, you wait until phase 4, you're going to open as if you did 9 months ago, because I don't think that's going to be the case. And I actually think it's a wee bit, you know, it's a wee bit dangerous if people are actually thinking like that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very helpful. What about funerals? You know, if churches could open for funerals at some point, there's a very good question from Fraser. In regard to funerals, what's the advice for managing distressed people who may arrive at a funeral and find they're not allowed in? How do we protect our elders or bereaved from potential abuse? Brian, what's the situation with funerals, and is there likely to be any guidance on how churches might manage attendance at funerals?
Yeah, we're very, very well aware of the sensitivities around funerals, and we are going to be discussing this tomorrow night. One of the issues that we have is that various other faith organisations are they're taking different approaches to funerals, and what we're trying to say is, look, we don't want people to be disadvantaged because if they've seen a church opening down the road that's offering funerals and they're asking why funerals in Church of Scotland congregations are not being held. We suspect it is going to be up to the local congregation, and in particular the minister. And this is one of the cases where the minister is absolutely key, because the minister is the one that conducts the funerals, and they have to be absolutely assured that they feel safe, they're in the right environment, and they feel supported to carrying out that funeral. No minister should feel under pressure by the congregation or the kirk session or whatever governing body you may have to conduct a funeral unless they feel it's safe to do so. Yeah. It's really, really difficult about the emotional sensitivities if someone is in distress at a funeral, because we can reasonably expect that would be the case. We need to choose our words very carefully with this. The Scottish Government are absolutely clear, and this is in the legislation as well, about physical distancing, as we're calling it now. Physical distancing must remain. However, we are humans, and if someone is in distress, if someone is in pain, then it's human nature that we do want to comfort them. We have to be very careful around this about the expectations, because what I don't want people to think is we're given a free-for-all, that at a funeral, social distancing does not comply, because it absolutely does. We need to go away and think about how we can communicate this in a way that's sensitive, in the way that would actually meet the needs of ministers, because ministers, as I said, are probably the most important people here, but actually also allows for the minister to meet the needs of their congregation when it comes to funerals. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to this. I think we need to go away and have a sensitive discussion about it. In terms of numbers, we discussed this, well, Brian and I discussed this, it's going to be in the agenda tomorrow, but how do you control people who just turn up to a funeral? If your building can take 35 people, what if 40 people turn up? Again, it's about a sensitive discussion about this, and making sure that ministers have the ability to turn around and have control of the situation. So we'll have this discussion tomorrow night. We will update the guidance on this. It may not be the right way at this particular time. We will keep this under constant review as the Scottish Government agenda changes on this.
And Brian, I think it would be fair to say that what's in thinking at this time is, in the same way that families at a graveside invite people to take a cord,
yeah,
and may give out a little card, actually what is in our mind is thinking that even if funerals are allowable in churches at the moment, because of the numbers that would be involved in distancing, there probably still has to be a strong element of invitation from the family, and these people have something that they can show, whether it's on their phone or whatever, that allows the people at the church to know that they're not just rocking up. And that's really difficult, but in the same way that families have had to do that for gravesides and things, I think we do have to look at that realistically, so that churches aren't overwhelmed with hundreds of people when they can take 15. So I think it is going to be a challenge as well. In terms of, just thinking about in phase 3, what do we do about toddlers coming to a church service if we shouldn't have a creche? Uncle Brian.
Oh dear. Well, I mean, we've had a conversation about this, and again, I think this comes down to individual local congregational need and responsibility. Now, it might be safer for the minister to say that, you know, we're going to worship as a family unit, and we just accept there may be some interruptions and some distractions as part of that worship. I really don't think I have a reasonable answer apart from that for that question. I think over the next couple of weeks, as things sort of evolve and we are physically moving into phase 2, I think we'll become a bit more aware of the physical restrictions in buildings in practice when people start, sending in photographs and saying, is this right, etc. So I think we can come back and have another sort of discussion about that. But if any ministers in particular, if you have any suggestions, please send them to me. Because we're happy enough to take suggestions in these things. I don't want anyone to feel as though that, we're a group of people sitting having a virtual chat and then making the decisions based on what we believe. We do take people's opinions and considerations and various other things when we're having our meetings. So please come back with any suggestions.
Yeah. Thanks, Brian. I'm just going to very quickly ask and answer a question from Christine about vacancies progressing at this time. This isn't for this forum, but there is another group working on it, okay? And there is likely to be some movement on that very, very soon. So we're hopeful that things will begin to move on with that. Brian, speaking of clarity, is there anything in the mind of the group or yourself that it would be better to actually put limits and say phase 2, 10 people, phase 3, 15, for example, a national number that churches can implement? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, my own view is, I've worked with many, many different congregations from all across the Church of Scotland family. And the one thing that I will say regardless of how they operate, is everyone wants the best for their own church. Now, some people may go about that in a different way, but as I said earlier on, every single congregation and every single church building is different. And I think what we should be doing at this time just now is supporting congregations to make a decision that's suitable for them. Now, some congregations may find that very, very hard because of various pressures, either within the congregation or from elsewhere. Other congregations will find that relatively easy because they understand their buildings, they understand their community, and they work more cohesively together as a session. If a congregation is finding it very challenging to identify what their space requirements are, please come and have a conversation with me, because we are more than happy to help you with this. Again, it is about having a conversation, and it's about creating a supportive environment. I think if we went down the route of dictating what your capacity is, I think we're moving into a different form of church, to be perfectly honest, and I don't think that's something we really want to do.
Speaking of different forms of churches, you see what I did there? The guidelines say that, this is from, I can't remember who it was asked, but the guidelines say that a welcome person at the door should ask people, every person wanting to enter, whether they are shielding. That's private, and shielding people are not a risk to anyone else. They should be entitled to attend without anyone preventing them. Brian Auld.
Yeah, I mean, what we're trying to see here is, and I think there's a wee bit of a paraphrase there, or I like to think there's a paraphrase there. What we're trying to see is that people who are in the high-risk group, now 70-year-olds were automatically put into that. There should be a discussion about whether they should be attending church, because there is no right or wrong answer for that person. When it comes to the highly vulnerable people, now these are people who are shielding. I don't think church is the right place for them to be at this present time. And this is what we're coming down to, this whole thing about conversation. You should be having conversations as a minister, as a session, as an elder, to say, look, how can we support your spiritual and emotional needs at this particular time? Now, at the end of the day, that's what we are saying. This is what we are advising. Now, what I wouldn't like to think is that church doors were opening and inviting every single person in, regardless of their health condition. I don't think that's morally right. I do take on board about the concept of asking someone, are you shielding? I don't think that's probably the right phrasal word to use, but I think it is important that when we are thinking about the design of the posters that we're going to make available for churches, we are going to make it clear that, you know, if you are shielding, this is possibly not the right place for you to be. And it's about people making that informed decision. I don't think church should be in the business of acting as a bouncer. That's not what we're here for. But I think it's about giving people the advice, giving people the information. And if they choose not to follow that advice and information, then I think that's a personal choice. Okay.
I think folks are making valid points that people in shielding are not necessarily ill, and that's true. And ministers who are shielding are not ill, they're not infectious or dangerous. It's a personal thing. And there's a bit of chat about those ministers who are shielding, who perhaps are worried about what's going to happen going forward or not getting much support or guidance. Can I ask that anyone in that situation urgently emails Faith Nurture and actually urgently emails it would be Leslie Stewart, L Stewart, Stewart, at Church Scotland, and actually just speak to her about these things, because you need the support out there to feel comfortable. And everything that these guidelines have done, they've tried to put the minister as part of that decision-making process. And just going back to what Brian said about funerals and ministers being important in that process, absolutely. But even if a minister really wants to take a funeral, if the Kirk session have decided that the building is not yet open, then there's nowhere to go on that one, unfortunately. There needs to be a decision to open the building that's discussed with everyone, and that permission is granted for that before anything can take place. Can I just, Brian, go on to a couple of wee things?
Sorry, Brian, see, just before you do that, something just popped up on my screen to ask, you know, basically confirming that people who are shielding are not infectious or they're not ill. Absolutely correct. but they are at a higher risk. This is what the shielding is about, that if they were to come into contact with the COVID-19 virus, they are at a higher risk of infection. And it's not about necessarily the church environment being unsafe for them, it's actually how they're getting to church as well. We need to be mindful of that. So I think it's really, really important we, as far as we possibly can, consciously agree to abide by the Scottish Government guidelines on this.
Okay, excellent. Thinking about very quick things here, Brian, because we're running out of time. At what phase can we have a live stream from the church building, for example, with more than 2 people in it, but not congregations, so more than the minister and a tech operator or whatever? And if we're planning a virtual holiday club, for example, might it be possible in August to have more than 2 leaders for the holiday club in the church in order that they can live stream that?
Yeah.
So thinking about when extra people will be allowed in church to facilitate those events.
I suspect that that would be phase 2. When we're opening up the church for individual prayer, that's when we are basically saying more than 2 people can be in our buildings at any one time. So if things go to plan, I think that will come over the next couple of weeks.
Okay, thank you. Another question, and this is David Pitcaithley, which is a really important question, and then I'm going to come to Ruth for one that lots of you are asking, okay? David says, and David's in Carlisle, but he says, I have an addiction support group pressing to open when groups of, say, a dozen are allowed to do so. Can you envisage a situation where we will enable compassionate groups to meet in the building, but we choose to delay meeting for worship? I think that's a really helpful question.
Yeah.
Thanks, David.
You can. Now, certainly what the current regulations allow for now for an addiction support group, I actually do think this would come under this definition, is churches can be open to support groups of vulnerable adults, and they're quite explicit about this. Now, I think something like an addiction support group would come within this definition. What we would ask you to do in that particular case is you get confirmation from your local authority that that group is required to support vulnerable people. And if you can get that confirmation in writing from the local authority, then you can come back to us and we will support you to provide that particular service. There shouldn't be any issue with something like that. What we do have issues with is when people phone up to say, you know, Slimming World, they're championing at the bit, you know, they're having real concerns. You know, we've got vulnerable people who are overeating in our community. We need to support them. That's not what the regulations are about. I'm sorry
Brian,
to say.
I'm very disappointed in that because I need Slimming World more than anyone.
Well, they've got an online app, Brian.
Feast yourself. Now, before we go to Ruth, what about the meaning of the terms extended group and mass gatherings? Is there any advice on a glossary as to what they might mean?
Well, extended groups is really more than 2 people. And mass gatherings is, you know, the definition is going to change under the regulations when they are reviewed. Now, the regulations are currently being reviewed just now. As we know, Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister, should I say, will make her announcement tomorrow. There'll be a further update. And my understanding from speaking to the Scottish Government last week is they are going to publish definitions of these for people to follow.
Okay, very briefly, it's been said that allowing someone over 70 into the building might break insurance conditions. Is that so?
It's not something that I'm aware of at this particular time, and I'm in regular contact with COSIS, but I will let you know. Yeah.
Excellent. Now, Ruth, we're going to ask you 2 questions to finish, okay?
Okay.
There is a lot of upset and chatter over the negative press about the over 70s thing.
Yes.
And people saying that they're getting emails and comments about that.
Yes.
Is there any way that we can counter that in terms of making a statement, giving ministers something that they can say, that because, as we know, these are a very bad caricature of what is actually intended in the guidance?
Yes, absolutely. We didn't know that comment piece was coming. I think the writer of that is a former, from a long time ago, editor of Life and Work, so she obviously has very specific views about the Church of Scotland, and it's a fairly excoriating piece, I have to say. We, in the first instance, will write a letter to the editor. She's not a reporter, she's a commentator, so she is allowed to comment with our own personal opinions, and we have a little bit less of a way of saying what she said is not an accurate report because it's her personal opinion. But we will write a letter to the editor. We've already had a number of church people contacting us to say that's not what they took from the guidance. That wasn't their understanding, that it was in some way banning over 70s. They didn't take that from it, and they will be writing to the Herald to complain about the comment piece. So we can encourage all of you, if you feel minded, to drop a quick line to the editor about that comment piece today. The more the merrier that join in with that process. And we can share with you, we've been talking offline as I've been in this meeting about the tone of what we say in our response. But if the other thing to say is the guidance is online. Encourage people to go and read it for themselves and, talk about it. It is complex. There's a lot of detailed information in there. There's a lot of new terminology that we're all getting to grips with around things like shielding and people that are vulnerable. You're not more likely to get coronavirus if you're over 70. It's just that if you do contract it, the repercussions of that could be more serious for you. So that is something that even if you're hale and hearty and over 70, you need to consider when you think about going back to church. And that is the advice that we've given. So I would encourage people to kind of really self-brief themselves rather than taking something from the Herald, but also encourage you to kind of respond back to the paper directly about it. It's unhelpful in the current climate. But I think the lady that's written the article clearly has a bit of an axe to grind with the church when you read the tone of it.
Okay, thanks Ruth. And I think Sarah's put a very helpful point on about, and I think you've answered that, about how we can help share the positive news of
Yes.
the church and how we can actually do that. So I think that's in our hands. Can I also say, just as we finish, that it's also in all of our hands to say to Presbytery what it is that we are wanting from presbyteries at this point. Somebody makes the point earlier on that presbyteries are made up of ministers and elders. We had an interesting point where I said that maybe instead of the analogy of it being a school dance, maybe I'm the person sitting with a couple of tinnies up the back in my pockets trying to subvert the process. However, if you feel you're not getting support from the presbytery, of which you are a member, and you would like to see them play a more active role in this, it's in your hands. It's in your hands as members of presbytery to actually raise a point, and perhaps even raise a point together, to actually try and get presbyteries to play a part in supporting you. Because if you're feeling like that, other ministers will be feeling like that as well. So why not try it and see where you go? Equally, propose a central buying for your presbytery in terms of hand gel and sanitizer. I know Edinburgh are doing that, which is really helpful. So I think, sorry, I've just seen another post there from Alistair May. Could some of us work on the Ministers' Discussion Forum to word the response that we can post to concerned members in the Herald article? I think that is a yes. And I think if Alistair wants to start organising a wee group, I think that would be marvellous to that. So yes. But that's the end of our question time and the end of our time. I'm going to hand over to Jonathan just to do the thanks and finishes. But I think our contributors need a rest, a lie down, and a very strong coffee right now. And thank you for helping us in this ever-shifting thing. And I think there was an interesting point that people are saying, can we do another one as guidance changes? Can we do something else? So I think that might be worth bearing in mind as well. Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you, Brian. And I'm sure I speak for everyone when I'd like to thank both Ruth and Brian for their very helpful and very clear responses to all of the questions that they've been able to answer today. And I'm sure that if anyone has any questions that have not been answered here in the forum, please do touch base with them both. I know today's the first day I've actually met Ruth face to face, but I have met Brian in the past, and they're both very approachable and very giving of their time and of their responses. So I'm sure that if you've got any questions beyond today, please do get in touch with them in the traditional fashion. I also like to thank Brian for facilitating today's discussion and for keeping things moving forward, and also bringing his own insight. I know he's been very involved in a number of the working groups going forward, and we're very grateful to him for all of his input into all of these different areas as we're trying to make sense of how we safely and carefully reopen buildings when phasing allows, and doing it very mindful of the people who are able to come back and those for whom it will be a bit longer. And so very grateful to everyone who's been able to help us begin to pave that way forward. And we're very grateful for all that you do, not just in this COVID-19 outbreak, but for all you do in the day-to-day life of our church. And we're very grateful to you for that. Let's draw our gathering today to a close with a short prayer, and then, like we say, we'll allow Ruth and Brian to get a nice strong coffee. Let's come together. Gracious and loving God, we thank you for the skills that you have blessed so many people with, not only in our church, but also in our communities. We're so thankful for the opportunity today to hear from both Ruth and Brian as they share with us the things that they have been dealing with, not only here in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also in the day-to-day life of our church. Thank you for all that they do, and that they do with their colleagues in the departments. And we ask your blessing in all that they do to further the work of your kingdom. Be with us all, Lord, in this very uncertain time, as has been seen with all of the questions and the uncertainties surrounding the phased return to church. We thank you that we have these opportunities to bring our questions and concerns together in this safe forum, and we ask that you continue to hallow and bless that work and the times of questions that we have, whether it be in Zoominars or in the forums or in just in our day-to-day conversations with colleagues. Be with all who are in these difficult decision-making processes. And we ask that above everything, we put the safety and the care and compassion of those for whom church is something that is being so dearly missed just now. And we ask that you're with all who are journeying not only with this anxiety, but also with the other ramifications of this pandemic. We pray for all who are dealing with bereavement and loss, those who are dealing with loved ones who are unwell through other situations, but are really being restricted because of the various conditions in hospitals and medical practices. Be with us all, Lord, as we navigate this way forward, trusting that you are with us each and every step of the way. And as we go into this day, Lord, may your blessing be with each and every one of us in all that we say and in all that we do. And we ask that you continue to hold us all in the hollow of your hand, this day and always. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you very much all for being with us, and you don't have to jump off right away. We're not on a time limit, we're not on the meter. If any of you want to hang around for a chat, please feel free. Otherwise, have a wonderful day, and thank you very much for being with us for this Zoominar. Please remember that we have our next Zoominar coming up next week. Brian, you might remember everything a bit quicker than me. Can you remind everyone what's going on with the Zoominar with Gabby next week?
It's with Gabby Dench, and it's actually next Wednesday, same time, same place, and we've got Gabby Dench from Faith Nurture coming to talk to us about caring for ourselves in this time, and I think that's going to be particularly important as we move to the phased reopening. We are aware of the stress, we can see the stress, we can feel the stress that ministers are facing at the moment. So if you can, I think that would be a hugely valuable one to come to. We're going to talk about the positives, and we might even talk about some of the negatives of how we might have found support or lack thereof during this pandemic, and how we need to change that together going forward. But join us next week. Gabby is fascinating. There's a lot of research being done on when stress actually hits people who have been on the front line dealing with families like ministers. So please do come along to that and begin to think again about how we care for ourselves. So as Jonathan says, thank you very much for this. We'll get the video sorted out as usual. But thanks, folks, and we'll see you later. Have a good rest of your day.